Hola a tothom.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Thought Biennial de Pensament. Actually, the last session of this year. It's been a very interesting week with so many people in the square, streets, talks, activities that we've organized. So 1,000 thank yous for being here and being here on a Sunday with us. My name is Nuria Moline. I am one of the commissioners of the Biennial, and I must confess that I was so excited specifically about this talk. This talk is one of the activities I look forward to the most, Utopia and Dystopia. The truth is that the reality around us oftentimes exceeds, surpasses the most dystopian fictions, natural catastrophes, economic crisis, social inequality, imposition, war. We want to believe that a better future is possible, a better future for everyone is possible, but the world shows a completely different story. And we wonder, what do we do with all of that? What are the attitudes, emotional management, generational realities, and cultural constructs in front of this collapse, in the face of this collapse? So here today we will go on a journey from positions or constructions such as catastrophism, nihilism, apathy, fatigue, or eco-anxiety, to movements such as collective organization or the OK Doomer motto. So we will go on a trip from dystopia to utopia, and we will wander like Sally Rooney, beautiful world, where are you, if it still exists? And in order to do that, we will have here with us, well, you'll see this session is structured into different parts. First, we will start with a prologue with two manifestos from two brilliant speakers. We will start with the writer George Monbiot. He's a writer and he also writes for The Guardian. He's an environmental activist, and he has published so very interesting books. If you don't follow him on Twitter, you should, because he's always tweeting about aspects related to this movement, claiming how we should go back to this connection with the natural ecosystem that we are a part of. And after George Monbiot manifesto, we will have Corine Pelluchon. She is a philosopher, professor, and she specializes in political philosophy and ethical and applied ethics. And after these manifestos, we will pass the floor over to two young voices who are part of this movement and who will give us a more generational and local perspective. We will have philosopher and cultural journalist Eudald Espluga. He is the author of the essay "Don't Be Yourself: Notes on a Fatigued Generation," and the writer Layla Martínez. She is an editor of Levanta Fuego, a publisher, and she's the author of Utopia is Not an Island, on the need to go back to this utopian drive. So having said this, thank you very much for being here. Let's welcome them, and we will start, as I said, with George Monbiot.
Gracias.
Hello, thank you very much, Nuria, and thank you everybody for coming on what looks like a beautiful day in Barcelona. It's also a beautiful day here in England, despite our slightly grim circumstances at the moment. Now, I've been an environmental activist and journalist for 37 years. And throughout that 37 years, I've been told by other campaigners, we don't have time for systemic change. We don't have time to do the huge system-changing policies which we think are necessary if we're going to escape our environmental crisis. We have to do what is politically acceptable, what is politically realistic. So small incremental change, and we must hope that those small incremental changes over time add up to the big change that we want to see. Well, it's now clear to me after 37 years, just as it was clear to me then, that we never had time not to press for systemic change. That what some campaigners believed was politically realistic was scientifically unrealistic. And what politicians and businesses and citizens might be prepared to listen to was a figment of our imagination. We thought, or other campaigners thought, that by being cautious, by being timid, by being careful about what we say, by only asking for small things. That was the way that we would overcome resistance. But it's so clear to me now, as it was clear to me then, but now in the light of experience, I can say definitively that the small asks were politically unrealistic. They never inspire people. They never bring people onto the streets. They never show people a vision of a better world. The smaller the ask you make, the smaller the commitment with which people will respond. And as for those mythical politicians, those mythical businesses, those mythical citizens that we were trying to appeal to, well, they were listening to the very big asks of the other side, the big asks of neoliberalism, the big asks of fascism, and being swept along on a tide of system change going in the other direction, system change pushing us towards environmental collapse at even greater speed than before. So while so many campaigners on my side of the divide were being cautious and timid and careful, we saw people on the other side of the divide being bold and fierce and driving towards a different world, a world that I see as a dystopia, a world that is now today becoming real. And it's not just that what they thought was politically realistic was scientifically unrealistic, and I would argue politically unrealistic as well, because actually it inspired no one and it achieved nothing, and it meant that all we were ever doing was fighting retrenchment after retrenchment after retrenchment as we were pushed back. But it also is a profoundly mistaken theory of change. I can't think of a single major shift in society which has ever happened as a result of incrementalism, of those timid, small steps towards change. All the major shifts have come about as a result of people setting out exactly what they want and pursuing that aim until they achieve it. Not until they achieve 5% of it or 10% of it, but until they achieve the whole thing. And when they set it out with boldness, and when they have a strategy for expanding the social acceptance of that vision, then not only do they find out that it can be done, they find out that it is the most politically realistic way to achieve change, that actually system change is more realistic politically than incremental change. So if we take the question of marriage equality, for example, which I see as a very powerful example of how change can happen. Only a few years ago, there was a widespread belief that if gay people were allowed to marry, that would be the end of civilization as we know it. It was going to be some sort of disaster. We'd be struck down by God, and no one would accept it. You know, the newspapers would not accept it. The politicians would not accept it. Businesses would not accept it. Other citizens would not accept it. This was an appalling idea. And just a few years later, it's like, well, yes, anyone who doesn't accept marriage equality is a bigot and a chauvinist. And you have all these people say, well, yes, of course, I was always in favor of marriage equality, when you know perfectly well that they weren't. Just like after the war, everybody becomes a member of the resistance. So what happened in that time? Well, what happened across most of Europe is that gay rights campaigners very effectively set out this demand: we want equal marriage rights, and then widened and widened and widened the circle of people who were hearing that demand and who saw it as a reasonable demand. And we now know why that succeeded. It succeeded because, as a large amount of scientific research shows, both observational and experimental research, once you have reached about 25% of the population, which then accepts a new idea, a new perspective, society as a whole swings round to accept that new perspective. And that's partly because we are socially minded creatures. In fact, we are, with the possible exception of the naked mole rat, the most social of all mammals. And as a long-established survival strategy, we are constantly looking out for what other people are thinking and other people are doing. And when we see that the social wind has changed, we turn to catch that wind. We don't want to be left behind. We don't want to be left out. We don't want to be ostracized. And so because we're so socially minded, we're constantly seeing if society is changing and if we have to change with it. And we might tell ourselves, oh, I'll never change, I'm this person, but we're changing all the time in ways that we're scarcely aware of. And then having changed, we believe that we were always like that. That's a weird human quirk. And so for better or worse, and very often for worse, people side with the status quo, whatever it might be. And so if we want change, we change the status quo. But it's also because society is a complex system. And complex systems and ecosystems are other examples. The human brain is another example. The global financial system is another example. They don't change in linear and gradual ways. They absorb stress, and then they suddenly collapse into a different equilibrium state. And that can happen politically, socially, just as it can happen ecologically. And while ecological collapse will be a catastrophe if it's allowed to happen, collapsing from one social state into a different social state can sometimes be a catastrophe, but it can sometimes be a highly beneficial change. So the exciting thing here is that you don't have to convince your fascist father-in-law that you're right and he's wrong. You don't have to persuade that person in the opposite corner to you to change their mind, because that's not how social change happens. And you don't have to make small asks if you want something to change. You just set out exactly what you want, and then you widen and widen that circle, preaching to the choir. We're always told, don't preach to the choir, don't preach to the converted. But actually, that's where we must always start. But we make the choir bigger, and that we make the concentric circles wider and wider and wider until we reach that 25%, and then society will tip. And there's another academic paper showing we very nearly got there at the end of 2019 with Fridays for Future. It looked as if we were really close to that 25% acceptance, that there was going to have to be radical social change to stop the climate catastrophe. But then COVID-19 arrived, we weren't allowed to get on the streets anymore, and the whole movement stopped. And so now we have to rebuild it. And that's depressing, but it's also exciting because it shows it can be done. We were so close, so near to the systemic change we want. So my message to you, and it's actually not a utopian message at all, it is the politically realistic message, is be bold, be brave, pursue exactly what you want. Don't accept half measures. Don't expect that little steps are more realistic than big steps, because the only politically and scientifically realistic approach to preventing the collapse of Earth systems is the change across society and across politics. In other words, systemic change. To prevent systemic environmental change, we must demand systemic political change. And the one thing holding us back from that is our own courage. Find your courage. Thank you.
Good morning, Barcelona. So I have a lecture whose title is Hope in the Context of Climate Change and Global Crisis. I'm going to say why, despite the extreme risks we are facing and which will in the coming years make life difficult for many people, it is possible to talk about hope. Paradoxically, this tragic situation calls for hope. However, this supposes that we understand that hope has nothing to do with optimism. In French, there are two words, espoir and espérance. Espoir is the expectation of something that concerns me, the wish to see my desire fulfilled within a fairly short time, whereas espérance, which is a theological virtue, does not concern a personal desire, nor something determined. It's the ability to see the future in the present, to give our times a direction which is not completely predictable, but is based on some signs that indicate a new era. Espérance refers to something which is already there, also it's not accomplished. It can nonetheless be announced, like in the Bible, which contains many elements I borrowed to build a secular notion of hope. Espérance is from Jerusalem more than from Athens. If you remember the Greek myths, the Pandora's box, espoir, elpis, hope, which remains when all things are gone, is a kind of consolation, while in fact an illusion, something that might be false, but helps people to accept reality. But we don't need such consolation nor lie. More espérance is born out of despair. This is the second aspect that distinguishes espérance from espoir and optimism. Hope is inseparable from the experience of despair and the knowledge of dangers, even of evil, and its expectation and the crossing of the impossible, as I will show in a book I will publish in France in a couple of months. So I shall develop 3 points. First, why does our tragic times call for espérance? Why, second, it is born out of despair and becomes a method and a decision, and in the context of the ecological collapse. Third, what kind of energy does it bring, and what is strong but not spectacular? So first, the specificity of our time is that we are facing the possibility of our impossibility. The possibility of the collapse of our civilization as a result of the disasters associated with climate change and our development model. The possibility of the end of the world, or rather of the end of a world. We are not only afraid for ourselves and for humanity and other species, but we have to recognize the precarity of our civilization. And we now have doubts on everything we have learned and we are proud of. In this connection, the end of the world has already gone. But the good news is that even those who do not want to think about global warming from morning to night can no longer deny the reality. The most courageous persons develop a form of anxiety and depression that is called eco-anxiety, which is overwhelming and is the result of this consciousness. This is precisely the time to speak of espérance, which is completely opposed to denial and to any form of optimism that would be a way of saying we have the solutions for the present. Espérance is a capacity to both see the mess and of the present and to understand the precursory signs of some important changes and of an anthropological revolution that could in the future lead to a more sustainable and fairer development model. However, in order to have this ability to see the beginning of a new era, which I call the age of the living, and whose far-bearers are the animal cause and ecology, and to think that this movement will be stronger and stronger in spite of all the regressions and the violence such change triggers off, you have to lose your illusions and to a certain extent hope. So second, espérance is a passage from death to life, like in the Bible, like in Ezekiel, when the dry bones return to life. It supposes the experience of destruction, of a complete night in broad daytime. Espérance is despair overcome, Georges Bernanos, a French writer, said. There is no hope without the crossing of that impossible, which is despair. Despair is actually a psychic death. It's a way of dying one's life or living one's death, as Kierkegaard says, in The Sickness into Death. When your reason and your will are humiliated by suffering, the temptation is to give in into despair. But if you give up even this will, yourself becomes empty or almost empty, since there is something left, the principle of life which makes you still breathe. Some people call it God, others nature, like Spinoza. I will call it life. It links us to other living beings, especially to animals. The recognition of this thread is like of life wraps you in sweetness. So espérance, hope, is the expectation of the unhoped, because it's born out of nothingness and was not expected at all. It is born when you believed you were almost dead. And those who have really exposed their subjectivity experience despair and overcome it by giving up false hopes, understand at the same time the precariousness of life, its smallness and its beauty. So it's from the loss of one's illusions that gratitude and the ability to wonder are born. It explains also the need to be surrounded by beauty, with beauty in order to endure the difficult present and to feel its intensity. To be a survival, in the sense that Derrida spoke of in an interview a few days before his death. To a certain extent, the young people of Extinction Rebellion I've met have a similar experience. I too had it. It first starts with fear, helplessness, anger, because nothing is happening and because governments are not doing much. People are still eating meat every day. It is a very painful experience that lasts for some time, eco-anxiety. You don't see how you can go out of it. And yet, it can be turned into something else if you manage to share it with other peoples, and above all, if you understand that the origin of such despair is a love for the world. Eco-anxiety is not like other despair caused by a lack of love for oneself and for life. You know that Kierkegaard said that the other despair can easily degenerate into hatred of oneself and of life. On the contrary, eco-depression is produced by the love for the world. So it's a grace and a burden at the same time. To stress this noble origin does not prevent you from suffering, but it helps you regain your self-esteem and transform negative emotions into commitment and good energy. Moreover, to look at other people doing their best at the local level, in agriculture, education, healthcare, to promote a fairer world and change the modes of production and consumption give you courage and energy. So the point is also to understand that the threat of collapse is an opportunity to formulate what we want and what we don't want, what we should keep because it's valuable and what we should immediately change and even abolish. Industrial farms, for instance. Facing the possibility of collapse should force us to make this inventory at the individual and collective level. And it drives you into being pragmatic. And this is the last point. Born out of despair, hope, espérance becomes a method and a decision. And in this connection, it is close to utopia. When Immanuel Kant said that there must be no war, that this is a category called imperative, a duty, he knows that there will be wars. But this utopia is a condition allowing its realization because it obliges us to seek which institutions will make it possible to install peace, a real peace. As with Ernst Bloch in The Principle of Hope, enlightened hope, Dr. Spes, and concrete utopia constitute a transforming force of the present, and hope detects the possibility of the future wrapped up in the present. But things happen in a perhaps less spectacular way than in the book of Bloch. Because the specificity of espérance is that it has energy. It's not a mere discourse. A discourse does not suffice to create espérance, which implies energy and desire. Exactly things that are lost today. Espérance is the experience of rediscovering the life after death, like in Ezekiel when dead stones are recovered with flesh. Moreover, it's strong but not spectacular. The question is, how can we bring a good social energy right now? Don't forget that espérance is born without being sought. There is no method to create it. Nonetheless, starting from reality itself, we can pay attention to the harbingers of a movement that is taking shape. For me, these harbingers are the concern for ecology and the animal cause, which is strategic, which is the revolution. We can underline its depth and its strategic dimension by showing what is at stake in it. Accompanying a movement and giving a name to an area is not dictating from above what others should do, but translating into words and concepts what is happening in order to give this movement a coherence, a direction, a strength, and maybe an efficiency, to help it win against all the forces that oppose it, business and so forth. This was at the core of what I call the New Enlightenment in the book, which is translated and will be published in Spain next week. But be that as it may, Espérance works for the present and above all for the future. It's a way of preparing for the time when the world will have to be repaired and rebuilt after a lot of catastrophes. Ideally, we should start to build something that would suddenly create the conditions for social energy that is not pathological, for a common future that does not presuppose the distinction between friends and enemies and is rather based on our shared destiny and includes animals. There is Espérance when you feel a good energy coming from Eros, not Thanatos. However, it's not a leader that gives hope, and our book does not suffice to create it. They can contribute to it, but it comes when it comes. It might be in the air, but we don't know when it arrives and how. So I will end with this image of hope found in Charles Péguy in the Portal of the Mystery of Hope. He wrote this text before dying at the age of 41 during the First World War. So it was very good to speak of hope, because he too knew what despair was. He speaks of Espérance as a little girl who holds her two sisters, Faith, who is a loyal wife, and Charity, who is a mother. And this little hope carries the other theological virtues, but she looks like nothing, and yet she can do a lot, this little one. She's the unhoped for, the unsuspected, what by grace or by virtue of the absurd, like the meaning of life after crossing the void, does something to life and to the world. So I quote Péguy. What surprises me, says God, is hope. This little hope who seems like nothing at all. Faith is a loyal wife. Charity is a mother, an ardent mother, or an old sister who's like a mother. Hope is a little girl, nothing at all, who is still playing with her snowman. And yet, it's this little girl who will endure worlds. It is she, this little one, who leads them all. For faith sees only what is, and she sees what will be. Charity loves only what is, and she loves what will be. Faith sees what is in time and in eternity. Hope sees what will be in time or for eternity, in the future, so to speak, of eternity. Well, to a certain extent, hope sees truth and justice. So, thank you very much.
I don't know if my mic is on. Yes, it is. Okay, so now it's our turn. And we will be talking for 45 minutes, and then you can ask for the floor, you can ask questions, make comments. I started working on utopias because I was commissioned a paper for a collective book on the first women who had written fiction, science fiction. There were people like Margaret Cavendish, Mary Shelley at the beginnings of the 19th century, but most of them were from the end of the 19th century. And this is what my paper focused on. So I started reading their works. Most of them were not translated. They're difficult to find oftentimes. So it was pretty obvious in my preparation that the whole majority were utopias. And all of them were a specific type of utopia, which was where Eden society is perfect, no, without conflict. Humanity had reached a point in which it had progressed so much that it had reached the perfect society. These were static societies where nothing happens, nothing really happens, meaning time runs, but history has stopped its course because we are already there. They all shared this same scheme, the same thread. Most of them were criticism to patriarchy, and they were most feminist, and most of them imagined female societies or egalitarian societies, and Matriarchy, New Amazonia, the ones that have been translated in case you want to look for them. And I wrote the paper, I finished it, I presented it. But what remained with me was this idea that it was very different from the cultural production now. How can it be so different? How can there be such a great difference between so many utopias at the end of the 19th century and these whole lot of dystopias at the moment? Everything that we see on shows, comic books, films, novels are dystopias. Everyone who imagines the future imagines a future that is worse. There are some authors, Ursula K. Le Guin, but you can count them with the fingers of one hand. Just a few that have imagined a future that is a tiny bit better. Even these authors such as Ursula Le Guin or Stanley Roberts, they are a minority, a very small minority. And even then, even they did not imagine these societies as perfect societies. These were simply societies that were better, but still with issues or conflicts. And I think this is an interesting idea too, the interesting idea of utopia, envisioning a society that is better, not necessarily perfect, because I think perfect is impossible. There will always be conflict, and it is good that there is conflict and that there are different visions, and that the thing is more about how to manage conflict rather than whether there's conflict at all. And so I was thinking why in 120 years things have changed so much. The cultural production, the imagination of the future has changed so much. And here I was met with this idea of the post-modernity theoretician like Jameson, who talked about the end of the idea of progress. What they said was that one of the key aspects of going from modernity to post-modernity was that the idea of progress had stopped working, had stopped functioning. In the past, they always believed that the future would be better, and now the future doesn't seem like it's going to be a better place. Normally, it generates anxiety and it scares us. And this was like a key in the change that had taken place from modernity to post-modernity at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. And we will talk about this a bit more later. We will go deeper into this key aspect and how, and this like wear and tear of the future and why it generates so much anxiety. And with the climate crisis, this is even more noticeable. It becomes even more difficult to think of a better society. And of course, when I got to analyzing all of this massive production of dystopias in different formats, we should also think that cultural production is related or linked to reality. This is also a problematic notion. We can talk about this, about reality and fiction, but these two aspects are linked in a complex manner. It's not only that fiction represents reality or the collective anxieties and collective fears, which it does, but it also produces realities. These narratives, this cultural production, also has an impact on the way we see reality, and it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. This double way of approaching one another, this two-way street. And oftentimes it is true that the role of dystopias is to warn us about things, warn us about dangers. For example, if we talk about novels, which is what I have studied the most, writers, their goal is to warn us about something, about, for example, the intensification of patriarchy, such as in The Handmaid's Tale, or the impairment of democracy, the loss of rights. And that's the intention. But the combined effect, or the fact that there is basically nothing else, that there is no other vision of the future that is so hegemonic, the fact that this fear and anxiety about the future is so widespread that not even subcultural or countercultures think differently. It is so widespread. This fear is, and this anxiety is so widespread that even activists or radicals who are going for a change, when you ask them whether they think in 40, 50 years the world will be different, well, they can't imagine it, not even these activists, even people who have this rupturist thinking. It has permeated, this anxiety and fear have permeated so much that it's everywhere. And it's not the problem of a specific dystopia or a specific book that is conservative. There are profoundly conservative dystopias, but the problem is not that so much as the fact that there is nothing else, and how it shapes our imagination and the way we imagine the future, and how this leads to stagnation in a way, or paralysis. This may lead to a collective paralysis, because in the end, if you always think, if everyone thinks that the future is worse, then the present is not so bad. I mean, it's like, okay, let's stay the way we are, let's hope things don't change, because if what will come is necessarily worse, then in a way this helps us justify a present which is far from desirable, which is far from non-violent, or is far from, even in the privileged corners of the world, and I'm not even speaking of other places. So even if that's not the intention of those authors when they wrote their dystopias, the combined effect is paralyzing. It is, in the end, a lack of a horizon, a goal, a horizon of change to go to. And in the context of a climate crisis, where we see the need to act quickly, it's like a ticking bomb, and the climate crisis sets a clock in our heads, and we have this need of a profound change in the productive system, which is pressing, is a pressing need. We see this year after year. We see how hot is it, for example, today, October 16th, it's so hot. So this risk of paralysis becomes even worse and more dangerous. And this leads us to questions such as, or aspects such as nostalgia. We'll talk about that too. When you turn nostalgia into a collective political narrative, because if the future seems like a worse place, it's quite logical to look towards the past, to look backwards. Because if you don't think that things will get better, it is easy to take shelter in the past, oftentimes in an idealized and romanticized past. It's like you remember only the positives of the past, and this comes with risks and also affects that paralysis and that melancholy and nostalgic vision that doesn't really take us anywhere if what we need is a collective change, because it is a relationship with the past, which is, I mean, of course, you can have a positive relationship with the past, learning tools, for example, in politics, symbols, emotions. But of course, it can also lead to a very dangerous relationship that takes you to this identity, nostalgia, and where you're stuck missing things instead of changing, instead of wanting to change things. And well, since we're going to be talking about this during the debate and amongst ourselves, I wanted to just throw these ideas around, and now I'll pass the floor over to Eudald. Well, actually, I'm going back to the idea that you were mentioning, this role that has helped helped us think of the concept of utopian dystopia. Jameson, he has one of the most well-known quotes that has been repeated again and again to tackle this matter, which is the idea that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And what interested me as well, in order to introduce all of the elements that Layla was talking about and we will be discussing next, well, we will go into this concept, even the quote by Jameson, which is very important. Deep down, I don't know if I should say that it hides or contains a way of interpreting and relating to temporality in a political manner that can be dangerous, because the sentence that reads, "It is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism," it talks about something important that you are pointing towards, but it's also related to the romanticization that there is nothing outside of capitalism. There is a novel, Cosmopolis by Don DeLeo, talks about this very eloquently. It's a very short novel, and it speaks of a multimillionaire 28-year-old crosses Manhattan during some revolutions, and he continues to make money out of shares, having fun in his limo, but he's seeing all of these revolutions and this upheaval, and a Buddhist monk comes and burns himself as the ultimate form of protest with death itself, and the protagonist ends up reintroducing this into his narrative as a form of creative destruction. This idea that capitalism always feeds from the criticism, and it can continue acting as a predator and dispossessing new areas, new materials, and new people. And in this sense, I think it's very interesting that even in the context of the climate crisis, such as the current one, we are in the midst of the sixth massive extinction, the fourth industrial revolution, with all of the energy crisis and this constant idea of collapse. Well, even there, we continue to think that this capitalism will continue to act as a predator. And I think this is related to what Layla was saying, and how this dystopian imaginary has taken the shape that we see, the way in which we see and imagine the world based on our own concepts. Even this idea of the Jameson quote talking about the end of the world and the end of capitalism. In the end, what lies in the background is this logic of the end. They both talk about the end. And if we imagine that we're headed towards collapse, or if we imagine that we are headed towards a perfect world like the utopias of the 19th century or before that, with all of their narrative eccentricities, well, Indian Thomas More and his Utopia uses this static image as well. So in both cases, we are talking about this idea of the continuous linear timeline, and then with a reaction of optimism or pessimism and not hope, which is something that Corine told us about in her manifesto. So I think it's important to do away with this idea of this ticking clock, and maybe we shouldn't talk about utopia as a static idea. We should talk, and here I am taking this idea from Maggie Nelson in her latest book about freedom, where she rethinks Foucault's thinking to propose the concept of liberty or freedom. But here I want to apply this to utopia, this replacing the static idea of a utopia for utopian practices, understanding that utopia is not something in the future that we have to move towards. It's something that is pluralist, that is linked to the present. It is a constant and continuous exercise, and even an imperfect exercise of transforming our conditions. We shouldn't think that utopia is this finalist idea, but it's present now. And this has two first implications. We shouldn't see utopia as a stage that we can anticipate, predict, as if it were a rainstorm. No, we should not try to predict. We should appropriate. We should have agency. We need agency in the present. The collective subject needs agency. And secondly, we should think, and this was introduced by Layla, this idea that utopia does not describe a perfect world, a better world, or a completely harmonic and free from power relations world. It talks about a transformation of these power relations to reach more social justice. But at any rate, we should see it as an exercise of this imagination, or what some authors such as Campagna talk about, a prophetic imaginary. And yesterday we were talking about this earlier. I was listening to Belén Gopegui. She oftentimes talks about how this imagination can be used in the present, and she talked about distinguishing between imagination and fiction, because fiction, especially in literature, asks us to be accomplices. Author and audience suspend reality because you're playing in this literary game. In the case of imagination, it's different, because imagination can take place in cases in which you imagine an object which is completely fictional, for example, a unicorn, but we can also think of other imaginative practices that end up leading to a transformation of the conditions that will make this future possible, such as, for example, a very simple level of imagination. For example, designing a home. You're imagining something that does not exist, but which may exist, and the fact that you imagine it is the first step to change the conditions to make it possible. And I will finish by linking this well, so that we can move on to the debate of the concepts. But I think it's important to have a way of getting into this imaginative practice, which is capable of changing present conditions, which is the concept of hyperstition, which is a concept that I like very much and has been used sometimes. And its origin, well, hyperstition is the combination of hype, the word hype, an idea that becomes viral, and the idea of superstition. And superstition, well, we all know more or less what superstition is, a belief that is not based on reality. And this idea of hyperstition, which is a concept that was developed by CCRU, the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit of the Warwick University, with some of the representatives that have dealt with DISTOPIA, the most Mark Fisher, Sadi Plank, or Nick Lang, and in which they developed this concept, and they defined it precisely as the products of imagination that created these conditions that will become real subsequently, with this logic of the self-fulfilling prophecy. And what they said was that there may be, as in the nostalgic logic, hyperstitions that would lead to a conservative logic, and recent hyperstition, for example, QAnon and everything that happened in the United States based on a series of imaginative practices. Far-right movement started, which ended up in Capitol. But we, if we want to have this utopian framework, we should also think of hyperstitions that may be in favor of freedom and emancipation, popular emancipation. And in this sense, I don't know, we may talk about books that I think you know well, such as Luxury Communism Completely Automated, or other works that offer images of a near future that do away with the dystopian dynamics that we're used to, and that I think help imagine a post-scarcity world, for example, when the management of food or energy is not only regulated by the market and a neoliberal logic, but that can overcome this stage of scarcity. And it is important to connect this with what we said about how we relate it to this cancellation of the future, how we can propose an idea of an alternative future. Yes, and also I think when I've given talks or I presented the book on utopias, one thing that I was told a lot by people, and rightly so, is that, well, how do we actually do this? How do we, first, how can we generate a collective horizon at a time of such social devastation? And even when we have that, when we get to that collective horizon, how can we turn this into specific actions? How can we transfer this to the plane of the specific that we need for the climate crisis? And there, I thought it was very interesting. Well, there were a series of talks that I gave with the collective against the deluge. And during the Q&A, they gave me this idea, or they launched this idea that we always need two movements at the same time. this idea of thinking or having a horizon, and it's nice that it's always the horizon, what Eduardo Galeano said, that utopia should be always 2 steps ahead, precisely so that it does not become static and paralyzing. When you take 2 steps forward, it's always 2 steps ahead, because this is what helps you to move forward. And at the same time, this should be conjugated with things that can be done now, not thinking of something that is too far away. And this idea of the specific steps and the horizon at the same time, well, I thought it was very... I think it can help us get out of this stagnation, this paralysis, thinking of measures that can be implemented now, but that target the horizon. And for example, I'm thinking of the reduction of working hours, which is something that can be done now. Reducing the workday, the working hours. It does not mean that it doesn't need a struggle. It will not happen automatically, but it is something that we could do now. And for example, this is a concrete and feasible measure with a horizon in which labor is not so much at the center, work is not so much at the center of life, very much related to the climate crisis. So how do we find these types of measures that can be implemented now, but at the same time can be targeted towards more ambitious things?
Medidas muy tibias.
Because halfway measures will not do. So this idea seems very useful to me. This thinking of both things at the same time. What can be done now, as you said, measures that can be implemented now, but always keeping this horizon in mind, these 2 steps ahead. And also this idea of how do we do this? How do we think of a better future the way we are, the way things are now? Well, I thought it was really interesting how not to let that utopian thinking become a narrative of capital, with this idea of optimism, which is something that you very well said in your book. And Corine also said this idea that, well, it shouldn't be, yes, you need to trust the future, you need to be happy and joyful. No, we're in the midst of a crisis, an awful mental health crisis. So what do we do with this situation to try and generate a collective horizon and to try and see a collective horizon that will get us going, that will make us walk towards it? I think about that a lot. I'm thinking about this all the time, and something that helped me, some clues that helped me, well, is thinking that first we always need to do this collectively. You at home alone can imagine a better horizon and you can convince yourself, but if you do it on your own, you will probably end up being like an Illuminati. And it's always easier to do it collectively, and it's necessary to do it collectively because this better horizon always needs tension. I have privilege, and there are other people who do not have this privilege, and they say, no, but what you think is a better horizon is not a better horizon for me, or it is not for these, and these reasons. This is what happened with this 19th century woman. They were bourgeoisie women. Well, they were the ones who could write at the time, and they imagined things that if we look at them today, they are racist, they are classist, and some more, some less. There are many different utopias, but some of them are awful, capacitist. So the collective gives you these tensions, things that you may not see and someone else may show them to you. And I also thought a lot, and I think this is an example we can learn from, which is the AIDS crisis in the 80s. It was, well, just to give you some context, we came from a certain sexual liberation and the LGBT movement that started organizing the first Pride events, and then this coming out of the closet in some way, and suddenly the AIDS crisis was like a meteor that fell on us like a huge catastrophe with huge stigma. At the beginning, people didn't know how the disease was transferred. There was a lot of fear, and in this situation, which for the LGBTI collective was a catastrophe, going back into the closets, having a huge level of stigma when they were just starting to liberate, and also this fear of contagion and seeing how your partners, your friends were dying, because at the beginning it was a death sentence. So how from that situation, from that terrible situation that generated so much fear and anxiety, quite radical militancy came out of that. How did they mobilize out of grief? And I think there's a clue there, because I think now we are grieving with the climate crisis, seeing the news. There's a lot of collective anxiety. So I was thinking of examples of people who have started radical mobilizations and collective mobilizations out of very difficult situations with a lot of anxiety, stigma. I don't know. I think there is a clue there to try and not just stay at the level of cheap optimism and saying, yes, no, you need to be happy and joyful. No, look, I am on antidepressants. I work 13 hours a day. How can I be happy here and now? I think there's a clue there to go away from this empty optimism. Yes, actually, now that you were saying it, this idea of this empty optimism is not only that it's empty, it is precisely linked to this narrative of the business owner who needs to make him or herself responsible for everything that's happening in the world, and which leads to them, in the face of this climate anxiety, well, they take it upon their shoulders and they think they need to change the way in which they relate to the world and not changing the conditions. So taking this distance, which is also individualizing and fragmenting, because it is understanding that all subjects are independent, ignoring this shared condition of interdependent animals and going to a mode of acting and thinking that is demobilizing and completely contrary to what you were saying about the movement of politicization out of this unease. And when we think about this dystopian thinking that has stuck and that translates into this blindness, when you talked about, for example, the reduction of working hours, well, for example, it's not that this is a possibility that is feasible. It is, well, there are already pilots and tests, and it has been approved in some countries, I think in the UK, and it's been somewhat successful. But despite that, since we are installed in this narrative of the impossible, even when it is approved, we see it as something that cannot happen. And this is related to, well, this idea of the cancellation of the future that we were talking about earlier. In the end, we do it because we see ourselves in a situation of inferiority and precariousness and mental health problems. But in the end, we are talking from the position of this post-apocalyptic subject that has accepted the end of the world and the fact that it's impossible to get out of capitalism. But this future has not been cancelled by everyone. And this is something else that is related to what you said earlier. If we want to propose this possibility of transforming things in the short term and not seeing utopia as something so far away, this is also related to the fact that the possibility of change is real, because this future has not been cancelled by everyone. And for me, this is clear, even when, especially when this post-apocalyptic subject limits its imagination capacity and is unable to see that with the 4-hour working day or the minimum income, well, these are things that are being tested, but these people think that this will make the economy collapse and it will not work. And it's the contrary, these neoliberal agents who functioning for the future, they can perfectly commit to a planned economy, which is very well explained by Martín Arboleda in his book on the possibility of a financial planning based on the people's power. And here we think, because of the Soviet experience, that a planned economy is impossible, but the big monopolies of the platform capitalism coming from Silicon Valley, Amazon, Walmart, in the end, they are agreeing on prices and planning for the future, and they are working with this idea that we thought was impossible, that we were told was impossible. So this gap is a gap of, if we say this gap is imaginary, we are doing away with the idea that we can do something in the short term, or this nostalgic idea. And the worst thing is not that it's not only nostalgia. There may be several types of nostalgia, and if we think of Benjamin and others that who look back to imagine future possibilities, but the problem is that we are falling into a nostalgia which is completely reactionary. And Melinda Cooper explains this very well in her book Family Values. In the end, what she says is that this cancellation of the future is like the adding up of the neoliberal and neoconservative narratives. The narratives, on the one hand, that say that there is no alternative, that it's the end of history, and that the only possible idea, which is the liberal thinking, has triumphed, and from now on there will only be business but no political and material transformation. And on the other hand, neocons or neo-reactionary narratives, that what they say to us, following the logic of the decadence of the Western world, is that the future is degradation and worsening of conditions. And it's a combination of these two, and this evokes a reactionary nostalgia that makes us think of going back to our childhood. And now pass over to you, because I think it is very important to see that this nostalgia in our current context of climate and emergency is, well, thinking of a very short term, the time of the first person subject, when you adopt this nostalgic discourse of going back to when you were in a village with your parents when you were a child, and being able to pay for a house and this ideal family. You're thinking of a very short term, the interests of your life, 40, 50 years, and you're not thinking of a timeline related to the ecology of the planet, which is what most narratives should adopt simultaneously. And I think this is dangerous. It's dangerous that we limit our political discourse to these 30, 40 years that I have ahead of me, and that's it. Yes, there's something that I also think of quite a lot, and this is, well, also based on a talk that I participated in with José Luis Rodríguez at the ICCC. I think of this idea of reappropriation of the end of the world. The idea of the end of the world, in the sense that in all big social changes, there's been an idea of the fact that a time had come to an end. And I think we are there at the moment, like this, we can go no further. And this is something that the climate crisis puts in front of us. This is exhausted. There's nothing else we can do here. But that's not the end of the world. That's the end of this. And they try to make us believe that both things are the same, but it's not the same. And this is something that was already present in the French Revolution, or this Soviet Revolution. In the French Revolution, this idea of the old world. The old world must die. But it's not that the world ends as such. It's just this era finishes. In that time, well, the old regime, and in the case of the Soviet Revolution, the world of the czars, it has to die. That has to die. So there is this moment of collective feeling of, okay, this has run its course. We need to change. We need a big change. And the thing is, not mistaking that end of an era with the end of the world, and that everything is over and that we are going to die. No, this time is over. Maybe it's good that it's over. But we have this idea that, well, we can reappropriate this idea. Okay, yes, this is coming to an end, but it's this that is coming to an end. It's this world, so that a new world can begin, so that we can see the change that we need. I think this is something that is fertile, precisely so that we do not fall into this easy reappropriation of saying, oh, yes, we need to be happy and optimistic, and let's think of a future. Let's reappropriate this discourse of the end, but not the end that you want, the end of an era, which does not mean it's the end of a world. It means the end of your world. And what China Mieville said, the fiction writer, he said, yes, we live in a utopia, but it's the utopia of capitalists. Yes, maybe that's what must end, and not the world. So of course there are alternatives. Margaret Thatcher said this so many times that the press called her Tina because of the abbreviation "there is no alternative," because she said it so much. But in order to generate this self-fulfilling prophecy, and the other famous sentence that repeats again and again is that the goal of intervention is not changing the economy but changing the soul. It's related to this. And yes, when you mentioned this idea of reappropriating the idea of the end, this is why earlier I mentioned Campaña, Federico Campaña. I mentioned him in passing, but he has this very cool idea of the prophetic culture. He proposes that as post-apocalyptic subjects in this situation in which we need to accept the end of many things, but not the end of the world, this is an end of the world the way we know it and our world view. But he said that at the same time, it was an opportunity to create new worlds. He speaks from hope and from this aesthetic interaction of attaching meaning and creating new alternatives to reality. And he uses the concept of the prophecy, which is also very nice to talk about this logic of the self-fulfilling prophecy, because he proposes examples. For example, if we think of classic literature, oracles, or what ends up happening is that a person, for example, if we think of Oedipus, the myth of Oedipus, when he goes to the oracle and the oracle tells him what will happen, that he will kill his father and marry his mother, there is no future prediction. He's not anticipating the future at that time, and this is the key of the tragedy. At the moment in which it's verbalized and he's aware of the fact that this may be his future, he changes his day-to-day. He decides that precisely because he does not want for this to happen, he has to leave. And this leaving is what ends up causing or fulfilling the prophecy. So there's this idea of creating world, space, and prophecy. I think this is very important. And I think it's very interesting in order not to feel this idea of the end so oppressively, because otherwise if we get into these dystopias, we end up seeing this idea of the dystopia and the end as a diagnosis of the social sciences, a sociological diagnosis that says, no, this is the way it is. This is idea that we've repeated oftentimes, and we accept it by saying that it's like Black Mirror. We accept the diagnosis just because. And I think it's important to work with this idea of the end. Well, I think we are coming to the last 20 minutes, so we can now open the floor. If you have any questions or comments, we can have we can collect 2 or 3 questions and we can answer them all together. I don't know if anyone would like to ask over there. Hello. Other questions for the 2 of you or for all the speakers? For all the speakers. Okay, so I would like to ask about a few things that I didn't understand. The first speaker in the manifesto was very inspiring, like the second one, but I wanted to ask him what he thinks about Eduardo Galeano when he says many small people in small places doing small things get big changes, achieve big changes. This narrative that we need to change everything, this changing the entire system, I don't understand that, because I think that when you get down to work from activism, it doesn't work that way. The second manifesto was very inspiring as well, secular, but with a lot of religious references. So I wanted to ask you why you had the need, or do you have a religious background that led you to using those references? And then to the 2 of you, things that I don't understand also. We are talking as if the collectives that are fighting against thousands of social problems didn't exist. So maybe we are forgetting about the social class, maybe because of the activism that I'm involved in. I would simply mention the work of the Kellys, the work of Kellys who are the chambermaids at hotels and their movement, Riders for Rights, residents' movements, the pensionists. So what happens? There are so many movements. Aren't we doing anything against the collapse? You know what the problem is? That the meta-narrative of collapse is being fueled by yourselves. You're feeding that narrative of the collapse, and you're not giving a voice, and you're not shedding light on what is being done and what has been done for a long time, which is the social struggle. I don't know if there are any further questions, so that we can collect 2 or 3 questions before we answer. Hello. I am a teacher of a school with kids who are completely hopeless, zero vision for the future, and with the absolute certainty that the collective doesn't exist. And I don't know how to change their vision, their view, because I cannot talk them out of it, because they're well, from their perspective, they're absolutely right. How can we motivate this change? And it's true, there are many collectives, many groups working, and there's more work being done now than ever. All of that is true, but it's also true that people, kids, boys and girls, who are the ones who will have to change everything, they have no idea whatsoever that there is something called society. Okay. Anyone else? Hello. I'm retired, and despite the age difference between my generation and you, I believe that for a long time now, I've been feeling these emotions that you have expressed, this despair, mistrust, pessimism. But I would like to link this with what the first speaker said, that, well, we're already more than 25% with utopian practices, so maybe now is the time to do something different. As she says, we need to think that we are in a society, we're not alone. I don't know, we're not alone, and we shouldn't, for example, go to the supermarket and not bring my own bags, because then they will give me plastic bags and they will make me pay for them afterwards. There are so many contradictions like this that we encounter in our path. So I think it's the time now to realize that we are in a society that has a collective strength and that we should get involved. Yes, would you like to, I don't know if Monbiot or if anyone wants to answer.
If I could come to the first issue first. It's very easy, if you look at society from a distance, to take a deeply pessimistic view. And I completely understand why young people feel despair. But what we have to recognize is that those who claim to represent us are, on the whole, wildly different and unrepresentative to the majority of society. To put it crudely, we are a society of altruists governed by psychopaths. There's a huge body of research showing that the great majority of people are primarily motivated by empathy, altruism, feeling for their family, feeling for their community, a general sense of wanting things to be good for everyone rather than just for themselves. But we're always told that we are primarily selfish and greedy. It's just not true. We all have a small amount of selfishness and greed in us, that's absolutely right, but those are not our primary values. And this has been demonstrated in neuroscience, in social psychology, and anthropology. We see it again and again and again. Very powerful evidence. These are not our primary values, but they are the primary values of many of those in positions of power and authority. And broadly speaking, if you're born poor and you're a psychopath, you end up in prison. If you're born poor and you're a psychopath, you end up either in politics or leading a corporation. there's a very strong preponderance of psychopaths in positions of power and authority. And somehow we as a society have allowed this to happen. And then young people being brought up in this society see what are fundamentally psychopathic values governing society and pushing us towards catastrophe. And of course, they despair. But what we have to recognize about ourselves all the time is that we are not like that. Our nature is better than we are told it is, and better than we tell ourselves it is. And that the great majority of people do not think like psychopaths. The great majority of people care about others. The great majority of people want a better world. And so it is up to us to mobilize for one. And while I completely understand despair, if we succumb to it, we make the despair real. We ensure that the catastrophe about which we are worried will happen. But that catastrophe is being driven overwhelmingly by a tiny proportion of the world's people. And it is up to us to mobilize in sufficient numbers to stop them from overwhelming what the majority want and allowing their psychopathic vision to prevail.
Thank you. I completely agree with what was said. And to answer the question you raised, because I can understand Spanish, but I can't speak it, of the choice of this religion choices is not a personal choice. It's because I try to give a meaning to words, and sometimes in all society, words are deprived of any meaning, and people who speak of hope, they equate hope with this bullshit thing, optimism, or with espoir, so that which is a kind of denial. There are people who say that there are technical answers to all problems, that every technologies will provide answers to everything. And these people who make money for that, they think that they will drive humanity into collapse. So I think that, and I think that the job of a philosopher is also to take care of words and give them a content and a meaning and also a savor. And in all society, there is something which is, the words are sometimes deprived of any meaning and used as if they were nothing, or used by people who do the contrary to what they say they are doing. And it's very dangerous, even politically. So it was the first, so it was not, you know, in the Bible, even if you, the matter is not to believe in God, as Nietzsche said, a philosopher is always atheist, even if he believes in God, because he does not ask people to believe in things. And faith is a passion, it's not reason. So, but it's true that in the Bible you have a lot of history of despair and also of a certain expectation or a way to see in the future things that are not yet here, but that we cannot scorn, and that we, as philosophers, intellectuals, artists, can accompany, so that this local strengths, this can be strong enough to build another society. I will give you an example, because it's not abstract. There are now, I'm not that young, and when I start 20 years ago to work on animal issues or environmental issues, people did laugh at me. But nowadays I have noticed that even to be vegan is not that weird, and that there are young people who try to show that animals do count, and that we cannot continue to have pigs that are raised like that, as if they were nothing. That's something. So I think that also the people of Extinction Rebellion and so forth, they have a commitment, and it's our duty to give a coherence, a strength to these movements, while at the same time, because we are older, while at the same time stressing the dangers of ideology and help them, find some bridges between generations, because it's not, sometimes people who are angry, and I completely understand fear, anger, depression. I think that they tend to oppose generations. And the thing, if we want to fight against the forces that will want to do business as usual, that want to continue to destroy the earth and the living beings, we have to, and if we want to change the model development in a democratic way, it's very important that we accompany a movement. And for me, I think it's our role to say that progress starts when it stops, as Adorno said. Adorno, a philosopher who left Germany during the Nazi time. So I think that the way we have equated progress with unlimited growth and all this stuff, it's false, and it's our job to not to say people what they have to say or think, but to grasp the movements that are there and give them some strength, a coherence, which is not ideological. And espérance is not hope, and also, and it will be, excuse me, I'm too talkative, I think that there are so many people who are desperate, and I really understand them, but I also know that despair can be dangerous. It can lead to destruction, self-destruction, hatred, the tyranny of the good, and so forth. And that it's very important but difficult to go through one's negative emotions, to turn them into something that could be useful, to have the energy to fight against some people who want to destroy the planet, and also to provide some alternatives to our model of development. And this alternative, of course, have a local level, but we have also to work on the national and international level. For instance, money at the European level goes to industrial farms, and we could change some things. So we cannot cut. And it's very important to care for words, because I think that nowadays a lot of words are used in a perverse way.
Sí, bueno, solo para contestar.
Just to answer briefly, something came to mind. You were talking about the fact that these social movements and these struggles do exist. But the thing is that, well, I think the climate emergency offers some sort of a symptomatic imaginary in which we question the value of collective political agency. The idea that if there is no structural change at the level of the dimensions of the problem, and connected to what George said, if we don't have this qualitative leap, I think in this field, in the climate emergency, this is where we really can visualize this structural change idea, and this connects to the idea of utopia and dystopia. And in these collapses where we see the tension, the narrative tension. For many years we've heard narratives of identitary politics, fragmentation of struggles, and I precisely think that claiming this concept of utopia is important, using this window of opportunity of the debate around the idea of collapse that may lead us to thinking of other struggles, that we may connect with other struggles. We apologize, but the person speaking now is not using the microphone. Yes, I believe that a problem precisely is that radical activists, and I'm an activist in different collectives, and I've been doing so for a very long time. In these collectives, you don't find people who believe that capitalism will end in 40 years. So, for example, if you ask someone, how do you imagine your life? How do you imagine things are going to be in 30 years' time? I have not met anyone that has said to me, well, communist society. For example, I've given talks to in collectives of communists in different communist trade unions, and not even the ones there imagine the world being like that in the future. And this didn't happen in the 70s. In the 70s, people did imagine that that's how things were going to be. And just think about the way it has stuck, even with those of us who think that things may change or that we want or are activists for change. Even there, in these groups, it is difficult to come out of this hegemonic and negative vision of the future. And what you said about high school where you teach, and yes, after publishing the book, I heard the concerns of different high school teachers who have said very similar things to me. They've said, well, with the climate crisis, precisely the youngest people are the ones who need to act, the ones who will need to do what needs to be done. And the fact that it has stuck with so very young people, and well, what can we do? I would love to have clearer answers or a roadmap, a clearer roadmap. But, well, I think that maybe, and this is much related to imagination and the construction of our imaginary, so maybe we should go for cultural production that does not respond to that logic. So that, I don't know, maybe so we can think of, or so that we can start to imagine other things, or we can start doing away with these negative imaginary, hegemonic imaginary. Maybe what I'm saying is stupid, but that's what comes to mind. I've been told that we have 5 minutes, maybe 1 or 2 final questions, very quick questions. Yes, the microphone. They're bringing you a microphone, yes. Yes, it should be on. Yes, hi. I don't know if I will make sense, and maybe, well, you won't like the way I will say this, but why not imagine a species without a future and without a solution? Other species will come. It does not lead to despair, it leads to hope. Our task today is to prevent the immediate suffering of people, but the people around us, and do things the best we can. But if we do not succeed, then that's fine too. I mean, it does not lead to despair. We are not the best, and other species have become extinct before us. So other hominids have gone extinct, and maybe investing so many efforts in fixing everything, maybe it's wasting our time. I think George would like to answer, and then we'll finish with that.
Thank you. I hear this quite often, and I have to say I am horrified by this logic. If you were to propose that a child were to die, were to be killed, we decide as a society that this child has to die because it would make things easier for us. We could just carry on better as we were if this child died. People would be absolutely horrified. But what this proposal is suggesting is that we should allow 8 billion people to be killed, including all the children on Earth, but not just those 8 billion people, but the great majority of the other species which exist on Earth today. Because what we know from systems theory is that Earth systems do not respond to pressure in these gradual and linear ways. As I said in my talk, all complex systems, they absorb stress, and then they collapse into a different state. And the different state will be a state which is uninhabitable to most of the species which evolved in today's planetary circumstances. It would be a different planetary circumstance altogether. And we've been there before. If this is allowed to happen, it will be the 6th great extinction. So if we look back 250 million years to the extinction at the end of the Permian, we saw, as a result of carbon dioxide and sulfates released from volcanoes, a cascading series of Earth systems collapses, where one system goes down, it pulls down the next, it pulls down the next. And over 90% of species became extinct, including almost all large-bodied species on Earth. It took tens of millions of years for biodiversity to recover. And here we are saying, well, it's just too difficult. You know, we would have to confront these big businesses. We would have to change our lifestyle too much. So yeah, let's just have the mass extinction. Let's see all of humanity wiped out and the great majority of the astonishing, wonderful, magnificent species with which we share this planet and indeed Earth systems wiped out, because that's somehow easier. No, that is not easier. That's the end of everything. That makes a mockery of everything that we believe. All our hopes, all our dreams, all our fears, all our nightmares are nothing by comparison to the prospect of extinction. And the calmness, the moderation with which some people say, oh yeah, that's all right, because we're not the best. You know, maybe a different form of intelligent life will come forward in 100 million years or so, and can contemplate the near extinction of life on the only planet we know that can support life. That disgusts me. We must fight for a better future. We must fight for a future that includes humanity, that includes all the species alive today, that we must fight again and again to ensure that they too have a future on Earth. Because let's face it, human beings are extremely resilient, and we will not go until we've brought down almost everything else. And then the global system will tip, and then there's nothing that anyone or anything can do about it. It'll take tens of millions of years to recover. We have the greatest existential challenge that any generation has ever faced, greater than the Second World War, greater than any famine, any genocide, any horror that humanity has faced before. And we have a moral duty to each other and to the future to rise to that challenge and prevent the collapse of Earth systems.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope this will be useful to you, and well, thank you everyone.